case. Yeah. Okay, and the third talk will be given by Harald Welte. And Harald, he's very famous for his action against the GPL violators. I think most of you have known him before. And today he will focus on the embedded device. And as you know, that those embedded devices, most of them are manufactured and designed and manufactured by Taiwan companies here. So here in Harald's talk today, he will talk about some typical types of the violations, and he will also talk about how we can avoid these violations with a little extra effort, only in the development process. And so now let's welcome Harald.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, well, we only have 30 minutes, so I get started. Yeah, there's a couple of slides in this presentation which I'm going to skip very quickly, such as this one. If you want to read more about what I've been doing, then you can check the slide after the presentation. I just want to go back to something that may or may not have been discussed already, something very fundamental. I think we talk about these legal issues, about licenses, license violations, about patents and so on. And one point that I want to make clear is that free and open source software development is not about legal issues. It's about creating technology and allowing other people to continue to create technology. And it's about fundamental freedoms, which are outlined on the slide. And the licenses and the entire legal framework are just intended to support that model. They are not the goal, right? The goal is to collaboratively create technology, and the license is just helping us to do so. So I think just put that in perspective when we talk about these legal issues. Again, some terminology. I think copyleft has not been mentioned before. Copyleft is the idea to use the legal concept or the legal framework of copyright to ensure those fundamental software freedoms for software. And so free software is not public domain software. It is copyrighted software, just like any other software that people create and claim copyright on. But the way how this copyright is being used is very different from other software licenses that you might find in proprietary software development. The GNU GPL has been mentioned numerous times. Is one of many licenses, the most popular license for free software. And it uses this concept, this idea of copyleft, and applies it to, in legal word, and applies it to software. And you could think of it as establishing some kind of fairness, right? A company that wants to create a product or wants to develop some software can use existing GPL licensed software and they can use it, without having to pay any license royalties or something like that. But whatever that company adds to this software, whatever you do, you have to give that back. It's sort of, you can think of it as payment in kind, kind of approach. So, and this method, like this method of sharing advancement of software inside the free software community is a motivational factor for software developers such as myself. The GNU General Public License version 2, it regulates distribution of software. Distribution can mean a copy on CD-ROM or distribution over the internet and so on. And it has fundamentally three conditions when you pass the software along. The license itself has to be mentioned, and a copy of the license text has to be passed along. And if such distribution happens in binary form, then the source code either has to be included with the binary, or you have to provide what's called a written offer, which says basically is a statement saying, well, if you want to have access to the source code, please write us to this or that address, contact us, and we will provide the copy to you. The GPL has a statement on what's called the complete corresponding source code. This is something that in practical GPL cases we see a lot of issues here. And the GPL states complete source code, which is the source code that needs to be provided, means all source code for all modules, which means the software contains, plus any associated interface definition files, plus the scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. Now, if you're a software developer and you think in terms of writing a program in C or C++, then that means you have the source code files, the C files. You have the make files, because make files control the compilation process. You have compile time configuration, such as the kernel config file. If you compile a Linux kernel, you have a file that contains the configuration of the kernel, and that is part of the compilation process, so it needs to be provided. Now, for many of the source code releases that companies in the embedded world make, they do not really understand what it means, complete corresponding source code. So I think the question or the check that you have to do when you make such a source code release is, well, why am I doing all this, right? Why am I preparing this source code release? I'm not preparing it because some lawyer has written that into some license, but you're preparing the source code release because the intent of this license is to facilitate a certain development model, a cooperative development model of software development. And you need to provide what's needed to make sure the recipient of the software can recompile the software, can modify it, and can run modified versions of the software. If whatever you provide is sufficient for the receiver to do so, then certainly you have fulfilled the obligation. Right? So I encourage people to think a little bit more in terms of practical issues rather than the last letter and the last space and the last word in the license text. Right? The license tries to describe the minimum necessary steps in legal language, but the goal really is that whoever you give the source code to, he should be able to modify, recompile, and rebuild the system. Right, modifications to software, well, a subject that has been discussed a lot in lots of discussions. One fundamental concept that people often get wrong is, I didn't modify the software, so I don't need to release the source code. The GPL, the requirement to provide the source code to a particular program is always present, whether you have modified that program or not. It doesn't matter. You always have to, if you distribute GPL licensed software, you always have to provide the source code for that software, even if you did not modify it. If you modify the source code, then there are a couple of things mentioned in the license. First of all, your changes have to be visible, identifiable. That's also something we see wrong in a lot of the source code offers coming from embedded companies, that it's very hard to find out what was the original version of the program, because they may have removed the version information or removed the changelog or something like that. And what were the specific additions that this particular company made to the source code. So a practical, technical solution to this is you have a tar file with the original source code, and you have a patch, a diff file that just contains the differences of the kind of the addition or the modification of the program you did. One potential technical solution to fulfilling that. Also, it's important to think about when does the GPL apply. As I said, it regulates distribution of software, and distribution happens whenever you pass a copy of the software around. And that can be physically inside an embedded device. So let's say you built this, this Android phone, or this TV set-top box, or whatever it is that contains a Linux kernel, for example. Then, of course, the device itself, inside the flash memory, contains a copy of the software. So when you give that copy of the software to some other company or customer, then you distribute the software. However, if you provide firmware updates on a web server, for example, then of course those firmware updates are again the GPL licensed software, and you're distributing it over the internet. So for that update on the web server, the same requirements regarding the license compliance apply. So for that update, you also have to include the GPL license text, and you have to provide the source code or a written offer how to obtain the source code. The corresponding source code to that update, not the original source code of what you shipped on the device, right? The firmware update is somehow different from the original software on the device, and for each of them, the corresponding source code has to be provided. Sometimes we also have different ways of distribution. We have digital satellite TV receivers that run Linux, for example, and we have seen firmware updates being communicated over the TV broadcast satellite to the device. Of course, that is distribution. It doesn't matter whether you send it over internet or on a CD-ROM or send it over the TV satellite. If the firmware update is broadcasted over the satellite, then you're distributing it, and you have to fulfill the license terms. With every method of distribution, it doesn't matter. So that needs to be thought of and thought about. Okay. That's the entire question of derivative works and GPL licensed software. I don't want to go into a detailed discussion of that, but what I want to come back again is, well, you can now, let's say you have an existing GPL license program, you create it, you want to modify it in some way, you want to add some functionality, and then you're trying, people are trying for a long time and put a lot of resources into the question, how can we do this without having to release our own software, without having to release whatever we do under the GPL? And my position is very clear on this. Whenever you try to do this, then you're trying to evade what the GPL tries to achieve. You're trying to evade, you're trying to avoid what the authors of that software originally intended. And if you're not violating the license text, you're at least violating the intention and the goal of the original authors of that software. And I would like to discourage people from doing that and work with the community, work together with the people who wrote that software, not against them. Okay, once again, take a break, go back one step. As I said, the license is not like the goal. The goal is collaborative software development. Intent of the license is to ensure everyone who receives the software should be able to modify it, enhance the software, and so on. So the more open the product is you create, the less you have to worry, because you will make the people in the community happy because they can modify it. If you use Linux and other free and open source software in a product, without enabling the community to make modifications or enhancement or making use of the freedom that free software tries to grant them, you're cheating, right? You're cheating, effectively. And whether or not that's a legal concern, right? I mean, that's something for the lawyers to work on, but you're cheating. And as I said, try to make friends in the community, not enemies. If you do license compliance from the beginning, it's relatively easy to do, right? If you think about license compatibility and licensing issues before you start R&D of a product, then you haven't done anything wrong yet. You can think about the problem, and you can, for example, integrate building source code releases in your build process. So whenever you build a firmware image for your embedded device, automatically it will not only generate the firmware binary, but also the source code offer, the tar file that contains all the source code, exactly the source code that was used to generate this particular binary image. And if you set it up in this way, well, then for each and every firmware build you will have made, you also have the corresponding source code. And it's a one-time effort you have to do. And no matter whether you do 100 releases of the software further on, it doesn't matter. You always have the corresponding source code. Also, you can decide your software architecture before you start your R&D, and you can think of license compatibility questions and so on. If you think of license compliance after the product has been shipping, then it's very hard. Because, well, often you see lack of good engineering practice, meaning that the old source code might not even be there anymore, right? You've been shipping something 2 years ago, and now suddenly, for legal reasons, you need to produce the source code that was used to generate this particular binary 2 years ago, and maybe the source code is no longer there. Or the engineers working on the product have long left, you know, or you, I mean, as the company in that case, and the customers of that company are under a lot of pressure because there's a legal threat or a legal challenge being made against the product. You might have already shipped something that's a derivative work to a GPL licensed software, which you wanted to keep closed, but you can no longer have that choice because you've already, made a wrong choice in the past. So thinking about GPL compliance after the product has been created is a big trouble and causes a lot of problems. And if you think about it before you do R&D, it's much easier to do. So please keep that in mind. Yeah, Linux and other free and open source software is everywhere. This is a in-flight entertainment system in an which airline was it? Singapore Airlines, actually. Yeah, Singapore Airlines flight, and for some reason they had to reboot it while people were inside. So I was sitting in my seat on the airplane, and I saw this message. You know, copyright NetFilter core team. Yeah. So do I do a test purchase of the airplane now? Yeah. Linux really and embedded free software is everywhere. You have the traditional markets, embedded network devices. We have telecommunications equipment in the networks, DSLAMs, the systems where your DSL modems attached to at a telephone company. In-flight entertainment in aircrafts, in-vehicle entertainment in cars, personal navigation systems, mobile phones, point-of-sales terminals, payphones. In Germany, Deutsche Telekom has public payphones that run Linux. They don't distribute them, so they don't have a problem, right? I mean, they're not selling their phones to somebody; they just operate them. Anyway, I've found Linux in exercycles, right? Fitness gear that you use for sports, voice over IP telephones, e-ink readers, and so on and so on. You can continue this list until I don't know, tomorrow. And you will find that there is a lot of Linux in embedded devices all over the place, and I think it's just going to grow for the next couple of years rather than go back. Now, let's look at a typical supply chain in the embedded world, right? You have the silicon maker that produces some system on a chip or some CPU module that where actually your Linux and other free and open source software runs on. Then you have a supplier of a reference design. This might be the same company as is making the system on a chip, but many companies have a third-party supplier for the reference design, the development board. Then you have an ODM that does the actual manufacturing and engineering and so on of a circuit board that contains the system on a chip on which the Linux and other open source software runs. And then you have an OEM that's selling the device under his brand name in the target market, wherever he's intending to sell the product. This is the minimum supply chain, right? Often the supply chain is even more complex when the board support package or the software development kit containing the GPL licensed software is supplied by, again, a third party, or maybe a fifth party by now. Then you have multiple companies involved on the ODM or the OEM side, and you get supply chains that are very long. And you have third-party suppliers that have application programs, which again might use free and open source software and thus have to be license compliant. So this can be very simple, but it can also get relatively complex. And if all the elements in that supply chain are not, playing along nicely and looking at their license compliance, then you end up in a situation like this, where the OEM has no clue what kind of software the ODM puts into the product. The ODM has limited technical skill and has no clue what the board support package provider actually did. And the end user buys a product with lots of license violations, which are copyright violations, and has no clue, well, who actually was in the supply chain, who has written which part of the software, who has caused any kind of licensing problem in the first place. And this is sort of the more or less standard case that we've been seeing in the last 5 years when it comes to GPL violations in the embedded market. It's getting better now. It's actually getting better for years, but still this is a situation that's very common to see in that market. There are some other slides on GPL and embedded systems. We have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to go through this quickly. One thing, just some thoughts to think about. The GPL version 2 was written at a time where it was written for the GNU project, which at this time was about creating application programs that ran on proprietary Unix operating system kernels at that time. So the license was not written with the concept of writing the operating system kernel or even writing or providing the software stack for an entire embedded device or for embedded devices in general where things are different. So one of the problems with embedded devices is, for example, the question of scripts to control compilation and installation, where if you develop an application program, let's say, a web browser or something on a PC, then you compile the software on the same system that you actually run the software. If you work with a small embedded device, you do cross-compilation, and then somehow you install it from your compile machine to the actual target device. And now the GPL says the scripts used to control installation have to be provided. Now, but the method of installation may not be a script, and you get into the question, what includes those scripts to control compilations to be compliant, right? Once again, my recommendation is think about the intent. The intent is to enable the user to modify and run modified versions. So if you include anything that's necessary to enable the user to run modified versions, nobody can make any kind of complaint against you. Well, then we run into the issue of digital restrictions management with regard to software. I'm not talking about DRM for media or something like that. This is completely not my point. DRM for the actual GPL licensed software itself, where a company wants to prevent users from running modified versions of GPL licensed software on a particular device, which are things like cryptographic verification of bootloaders, cryptographic verification, signature checks of the kernel images, and so on. I personally believe it's problematic from a GPL licensing point of view because you are depriving the user. You're removing the right, or you're removing the ability of the user to run modified versions of the program. Right? Let's say you're shipping an Android device, and the Android device is using some cryptographic verification to make sure only the kernel provided by the vendor is going to run on the device. The Android kernel will not run on the laptop of somebody else. So how do you fulfill the intent of enabling the user to run a modified version of that software if you remove it by technical means? So this is, again, as I said, it's an interesting question, legally difficult. Different people have different opinions on this. GPL version 3 makes it quite clear in the license text. GPL version 2, well, everyone has his own interpretation of what will eventually happen. We might see legal cases in that area, we might not. It's unclear. I would recommend you to not do that. GPL violations themselves are not really new. They happen all the time. Let's just have a quick look at the risks. Well, if you are involved in shipping a product that's incompliant to the GNU GPL, you're committing a copyright infringement. It's not different from shipping a product with unlicensed copies of Microsoft Windows or any other copyrighted software. There's really no difference. You can face civil and criminal charges in court. The civil charges in Germany, for example, where I do most of my enforcement, include the right to cease and desist, which means the copyright holders can hold the further sales, further distribution of the product until it's license compliant. The copyright holders can obtain information, what quantity of the product and to which kind of clients and customers it was been shipping. Damages for lost revenue is definitely something that can be an issue. And then, of course, civil charges can also be filed against every retail store, every importer, every distributor involved in distributing such devices. And the legal pressure against such companies will then turn into economic pressure on the ODM companies and the actual engineering companies that happen to be, in East Asia and a lot of them Taiwan. Okay, that's basically it. This is my last slide. A little bit of an outlook. I think the very clear GPL violations in embedded devices are declining. We see less and less of them, but likely we see them continuing, if not only because every year you see new types of devices that suddenly run Linux or other free software. And while until a certain point you may see all the embedded networking device manufacturers, they have now understood how to deal with Linux. Then a new industry starts to use Linux in their products, and they don't really have the skill or the knowledge yet how to comply with the license. We'll see more derivative works type GPL violations, and I predict that we'll see actual legal enforcement, or at least people who try to do that in the next couple of years. And there's an interesting movement, at least in Europe right now, or in America as well, always the content and the media industry is always demanding stronger copyright protection. And that stronger copyright protection then in turn also makes the possibility of software license enforcement, because it's also copyright easier. In France, we now have a law, a so-called 3 strikes law, where if somebody makes a copyright violation by downloading some copyrighted content off the internet, after 3 times they will cut his internet connection, right? So my question would be, well, can we use this for GPL enforcement, right? Can we cut the internet connection of a company if he infringed 3 times? Interesting new ideas coming up with stronger and stronger copyright protections. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.
That was it.
Thanks, Shan. Oh no, sorry. Thanks, Harald. And the same. One question open. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I want to ask that. Well, if I create a software I license under GPL, can I authorize others to sue the company that they violate my software license? Because if in normal cases, if I found a GPL violation, I have to tell the copyright holder that his intellectual property has been sold, and he have to sue the company. Yeah. So, is there any way to authorize others to do that instead of only the copyright holder can do that? Thank you.
Well, the copyright holder can, of course, assign certain rights to somebody else, and then that other person or organization can use the rights to do the actual legal enforcement. So it is possible, but you cannot just hire somebody to actually do the enforcement, but you actually have to sign over, or at least have some kind of agreement to temporarily or to transfer rights to that organization or to that person who will then, as a copyright holder, because he has acquired the copyright to some extent, do the enforcement. The Free Software Foundation Europe has a document called the Fiduciary License Agreement, the FLA, and this agreement can be used between a copyright holder and another entity to transfer sufficient rights so that other entity can, for example, take care of license enforcement. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Harald again, and please applause again.